right, welcome back to another episode of the Troublesome Terps, the podcast about topics that keep interpreters up at night. And we have a two-pack tonight because unfortunately Alex G and Sarah cannot join us today, but we still have two Troublesome Terps here and two guests, so we'll get to the guests in just a second. First of all, my name is Alexander Drexel. I work in the EU bubble, speaking here in a private capacity as usually, because that's all I got, as Alex likes to say. And I would like to welcome my co-host for tonight, Jonathan Downey. Good evening. How are you, Jonathan?
It's good to be here. It's good to be chilled out. It's a good time to do research and a good time to do interpreting right now, I think, Alex.
Yes, exactly. Because after the last episode with Ebru Dirika, we're again tackling something that is very closely related to research and interpreting studies. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a book about to come out, and the Troublesome Terps are involved in that book. More on that later. First of all, Jonathan, let's welcome our two guests. First of all, we would like to welcome Elisabet Tiselius, joining us from lovely Stockholm, I think. Good evening, Elisabet. How are you?
Oh, no, even lovelier Paris.
Even lovelier Paris. Oh, that is lovely indeed.
When I look out my window, I see the Eiffel Tower. It just stopped blinking.
That's about as Paris as it gets, I think.
Yeah.
Excellent. Should make for a lovely episode. And then we also welcome Michaela Albl-Mikasa. Good evening, Michaela. It's nice that you're joining us. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Hi, together.
Great. Jonathan, why don't you tell our listeners what this is all about? What's up with that book that we're going to be talking about?
This is the encyclopedia. It is the Encyclopedia of Conference Interpreting. I nearly tripped over my own tongue there. And this is, I think, probably the biggest collection of articles on conference interpreting that I have ever seen, possibly that's ever been done. It's bringing together a collection of leading authors, giving us articles on all different aspects of conference interpreting, from technology to training to practice. It has this innovative feature of talking about conference interpreting all over the world, about in countries that I didn't even know had conference interpreting. So it's really exciting to see all of this expertise in one place and in one volume.
Exactly. And if you're wondering why Michaela and Elisabet are qualified to publish and edit such a publication, just a quick piece of background. Elisabet is an associate professor of translation studies with a focus on interpreting, of course, and Michaela is a professor of interpreting studies in Zurich. So they are literally writing the book about interpreting, and that's what we are going to be talking about tonight. But maybe briefly before we jump in, Elisabet, I know you've talked to me on the Lang FM podcast a few years ago. You've talked to Jonathan as well, but can you just give us a very brief sort of your bio in just a few keywords, your interpreting bio?
I started as a conference interpreter when Sweden joined the European Union, or a little bit later, actually. We joined in 95. I started interpreting in 96. I have been conference interpreting since then, and a little later into my career, I also started doing public service interpreting. So I am a state authorized public service interpreter as well, between English and Swedish. And my working languages in conference interpreting is Swedish, English, and Danish. English, French and Danish into Swedish. Difficult to keep track of all the languages. And when I felt that I wanted to dig deeper into interpreting, I started writing a PhD on expertise in interpreting. And since then, I have also been working with research and teaching and taking up a position at Stockholm University.
And Michaela, how did you get to be a professor of interpreting? What happened before that?
Yeah, I studied conference interpreting in Heidelberg, and quickly realized that I was more into the academic track than the practical interpreting. I did it actually for about 5-6 years, then handed over my interpreting assignments to my husband, who is an AIC interpreter, and thought that, having a family and doing a PhD and following the academic track is quite a bit. So I concentrated on that, and I left practical interpreting behind. But through my husband, I always followed up on what the colleagues were doing, what the market was doing, what was happening, what the developments were. So, I have an idea of practical developments as, of course, of theoretical developments. And then I did my PhD. First, I started it at the University of Heidelberg, then came to the University of Tübingen with my professor, my supervisor at the time, and then had a chance to go to the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, where I got this, where I had an opportunity to apply for this professorship. And here I am, and I've been doing this for about 10 years now. And my PhD was in note-taking for consecutive interpreting.
That is enough to scare a lot of conference interpreters out there, but that's not our main focus for tonight. Thanks very much. And one last, let's say, biographical question before we dive into the topic is, did you two team up for this book project, or have you collaborated before? Have you known each other for a long time, or how did that happen?
We actually have known each other too well. I mean, we have met at the occasional conference, obviously, and we knew each other's papers, but we hadn't had a chance to really interact much. And I was approached by Routledge as to whether I wanted to edit the handbook. It's actually a handbook. It's not an encyclopedia. Sorry to correct you.
I will correct the record of that later.
But there is a bit of a difference. So I would really like to make this clear. It's not an encyclopedia. It's a handbook. Because the chapters in the build-up is quite different. I have no idea why they approached me. I assume because I was a consultant editor with Mona Baker's Routledge Encyclopedia of Translation Studies. So that may be, and I was the consultant editor for interpreting. So that may be why they asked me. And then I thought, well, it's a very interesting proposal, a very interesting, thing to do. But I was quite sure from the very beginning I didn't want to do it on my own. Elisabet had asked me a little while ago to co-edit a special thematic section in Translation, Cognition and Behavior, the journal, on community interpreting and cognition. So from that, I had known Elisabet a little bit. I knew she was, cool, calm, collected, and competent.
That sounds like Elisabet. Yeah.
And I mean, virtually. This was the reason why I felt she would be the ideal partner and co-editor for this project. And this is why I asked her, and she immediately said yes, and we took it from there.
Yeah, and it was also fun because we had started. The reason I asked Michaela to co-edit that special issue of translation, cognition and behavior was that we were at that point two of the few really working on cognition in dialogue interpreting. And when we started looking at each other's publication, it turned out that we have actually followed each other quite well in what we have been interested in and what we published on. And Michaela has also looked into deliberate practice among conference interpreters and done interview studies on that. And we have both been interested in expertise and in cognition and in dialogue interpreting and so on and so forth. So it felt like this was really, we probably had the same idea about things. So when Michaela asked me, I was, of course, very humbled and happy and wanted to go into that. But I also must say, and I think that's important to say, that there's a lot of handbooks coming out, and we thought a lot about how to make this really a standing out project on its own. What would be the value of this particular handbook? And also there was a very good encyclopedia, I'm sure you know about it, the Encyclopedia of Interpreting Studies that came out in 2013, I think. 2015, which is a really all-encompassing work on interpreting studies. And then what you want to do is, of course, to carve out, we want to approach this in a different way, because this has to be a work that can be read by other people, by a new audience, hopefully, but also an audience that can find something more or something in a different area than what they would have found in other books on the market.
But this is also a reason why I got interested in the project, because, in the encyclopedia, you have these entries, which are not all very short, but still you kind of scratch the surface. You can't really go into depth. And with a handbook chapter, you have much broader scope to really dig a little bit into the subject matter. So a handbook gives you, a better platform for dealing with your subject matter.
Yeah. And then when we started talking, we also quite quickly, both of us realized that nobody's done anything like this on conference interpreting, because there has been so much of an interest for dialogue interpreting or for the other types of interpreting. So the research on conference interpreting has been ongoing, but no one has actually taken a whole grip on conference interpreting and tried to establish where are we going, what is conference interpreting.
And we don't have a single volume which covers it all. I mean, it just wasn't there in that way.
And I think that's important, especially considering the recent research that's starting to poke around at the gaps, the differences between interpreting settings to be able to carve out and say, this is our handbook on conference interpreting is actually valuable for precisely that discussion, because then people can start mapping the differences and similarities much more easily.
Yeah, and I know you promote a lot, Jonathan, the idea of interpreting is interpreting, which I agree on in principle. But if you, just as you say, if you want to argue that interpreting is a general task or a general occupation that has different sides to it, maybe, or different fields, then we have to also figure out how is it similar and how is it different, and for that this type of volume serves a good purpose as well.
So I think you've alluded to it a little bit already, but I think that the question is who is this handbook for? Did you have a specific audience in mind, or is it really more general, because you said you're trying to cover pretty much all of conference interpreting, which seems like a daunting task?
I think it's for the community to start with, for the researchers, but also for the trainers, for the students, and then also for the practitioners. That was one thing that we felt was particularly important. And I mean, this is one reason why we invited you guys. We really felt that even though in many chapters you will find that the practical aspects are always there, they are always covered, but still we wanted to make sure that we had practitioners on board who would take this particular perspective.
I was hoping that it could be this type of handbook where when you start teaching a conference interpreting student, you can use it, because then you can use the first chapters of the book where we talk about the fundamentals and the different modes, and it's very sort of practical into the profession of conference interpreting. And then also for a practitioner or for someone who's trying to get an overview of what conference interpreting is, we have the section about the different countries and the different settings and where does it happen. And these chapters are also very some of them, or most of them, I'd say, are written by both practitioners and teachers and researchers. So they are very hands-on. And then coming up to the later sections in the book, that could be used for our master students or a beginning PhD student, where we have an overview of more research aspects of conference interpreting. And then finally, at the end, we have sort of the new openings or the new venues of conference interpreting, where we look at both this infamous or existing or non-existing gap between the practice and the research, or the profession and the research, but also completely new things like mindfulness and in conference interpreting, and of course the technology that we all struggle more or less with currently.
Yeah, exactly.
And sign language. We shouldn't forget sign language.
Yes, excellent point. Maybe we can start a little bit at the beginning, because Jonathan has published books before. I've published books before, but neither of us have published a handbook like this with, as you just said, over 70 contributors. So how does a project like this start? Do you have like a basic structure on the back of a napkin? Do you have specific people that you definitely want to have as contributors? How does that start?
It's like, like any interpreter knows who they want to take into the booth, because they know the interpreters who have the language pair. They know the interpreters who can deal with certain settings, with certain assignments,
Yes.
with certain situations, etc. And the same applies to us. We know the conference interpreting academic and scientific community. We would quite well who is actually tackling which subject matter, who is an expert in what field and subfield. So obviously we discussed it amongst each other, and we came up with a list of people that we thought would be just the people who would have something in depth and interesting to say on the matter. And then we started to invite those people, and we're quite lucky. We did have a couple of rejections and no's to our invitation. Which is actually also due to the fact that there were about 5 Routledge handbooks in the pipeline, and people just couldn't cope time-wise.
Yeah.
They just didn't have the capacity to deal with it, and we were a little bit astonished because we had not been made aware of the fact that there were other handbooks also in the pipeline. So, but on the whole, what, Elisabet, 90% of people that we wanted to have on, gave us a yes, accepted our invitation. And as you can see from the table of content, they are all there.
Yeah.
The people we wanted to have on board, they are there, and this is fantastic.
One point we figured out, but this person would be perfect for that chapter. But this person too. So when we'd done that a couple of times, we were like, okay, so let's start ask people if they can co-author. So a lot of the chapters are co-authored, and that is because we have actually asked them to do that, because there are obviously when a field matures, there are several people who knows a lot about a certain topic or a certain area. So what not better than for these experts in the field to collaborate? And many of them had not collaborated before, and we approached them quite frankly and said that we think you would be perfect to write this chapter together, and would you agree to do so? And the same thing there, almost all of those that we approached agreed to do it, which we found also very generous. And because it's not easy, especially then you have to know both about the how when you publish in human sciences, it is you get more points or you get more credits if you publish as a single author than as a double author, and so therefore doing this project together with us as co-authors was also very generous from the community. And another generous thing from the community as well, we talked about all these different handbooks that started coming out, and in the beginning we were quite shocked and thought that, how can we all contribute? But we actually sat down with a few of the other editors and discussed what will you be writing about, so we don't write about the same thing? How do we draw the lines between the different handbooks? Because all of us, of course, wanted to have something rather than competing, but having something that could complete each other.
That sounds lovely. You did a little bit of community building as well. Sorry, Michaela, go ahead.
Yeah, and in some cases it didn't work out. We didn't get the person we had thought would be the right person to do it. But then people from the community suggested other people. We approached those, and in a couple of cases we even ended up having an author who was even more qualified or more expert in the matter. And so it sometimes takes on its own dynamics and works out really well.
What really impresses me is that I'm used to seeing in handbooks and encyclopedias a certain subset of the field that appear over and over again. And there's a real amazing cross-section in this of you've got the the expected names, but you've also got some people whose work I'm like, oh, I need to go and look that person up. Were there times that you were surprised at people who said yes, or surprised at the people whose names that came up, or was it always people that kind of names you were expecting?
Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you think that because you read the last couple of contribution an author has, or you are not fully updated with contributions from an author, so you think that they're an expert in a certain area, and then you realize, well, looking into that author, that in fact that author has published a lot in this other really interesting area as well. So sometimes we had a short swap or change of direction, actually. But also we were happy to see that new names came up, new names to us as well, that, by asking around and digging around a little bit, and new very good names, not the community is growing, so we can't know everyone, of course. And it's great to see that new names are coming up and new really good contributions are made.
Yeah, and we had all those suggestions, recommendations from people, and then in some cases we had to really search for people. We had to be be in a kind of for instance, for the India chapter, I was head on. I was certain, and I really wanted to have this chapter on India. But I wasn't quite sure who could do it, because, would you know who is an expert? So we started to search around with AIC, and we found the head of the regional head for India. We asked her, and then she recommended this professor at the Delhi University. They teamed up together, which was perfect, because she came from the more practical side, and the professor came from the more theoretical side. And it turned out they were just the team we needed for this kind of chapter. But other than that, I think we had rather more chapters than we had initially thought of. Then less.
That's what I would expect.
Because, as you start digging into it, you realize you want also this chapter, you should have one on that matter, etc. And in two cases, we even, at a rather late stage, we realized, oh God, we don't have a chapter on that, and it would perfectly match, and it would also need to be there. So at a very late stage, we started to approach authors for those two chapters, and we're just very lucky for these people to say, yes, we can do it at a short notice.
It really does testify to the breadth of research in conference interpreting, because a lot of people who've, trained as conference interpreters, or who know a bit about conference interpreting, might know things, they might expect something on note-taking, or they may expect something on quality and norms, but there's an incredible breadth of research and really showing how vital and how alive the conference interpreting research and practice community really is right now.
Yeah, and with many new openings, new fields.
Now, since you mentioned the pandemic, did that, I don't know, the project probably started before the pandemic began, or at least the first ideas, I'm guessing. Did that influence the project at all? But because, the work is mostly distributed, I think, but did it maybe change deadlines or anything else in the project?
Michaela started being very determined, saying that we will not let this delay us.
Yeah.
And I was totally behind that. So we worked really hard to be able to continue on the timeline despite the pandemic. But obviously, one thing that was hard for the authors was that if we publish a book right in the middle of or towards the end of the pandemic, we can't just have it without any mention of the pandemic. But a lot of it, we don't know how it will unfold. So we had a demand on all the authors that they have to discuss the pandemic in their chapters. But it is a challenge for the authors, of course.
They were just excellent. They all tried to make sure to deliver in time, and they all did their best. So we did manage to stick to our timeline and to our deadline.
And we should also mention Sergio Viaggio, because that was really sad.
Yes.
He came onto the project in a typical Sergio way, being very happy and of course and no problem. And he was adapting to all our ideas and suggestions and so easy to work with. And by the time that the chapter was slowly coming to an end, suddenly, I think we exchanged emails only a couple of weeks before, and then suddenly the news of his death hit us. So that was really sad and very abrupt to the project. Not that it didn't stop us, but it definitely it made COVID very real.
But is his contribution still in the book to some extent?
Oh, yes.
He's a co-author of the diplomatic interpreting chapter.
Excellent.
So the two co-authors finished it. One of them gave me the bio of Sergio because that we didn't have, and he supplied it. So his name is still on. He wrote his part of the contribution and of the chapter.
Wonderful.
Yes. So he's definitely on, and maybe he has some ways of knowing about it, but he knew. Yeah. I mean, he was still with us at the point when we confirmed to him that everything was accepted, everything was confirmed, and that he would be in the book. So he knows that. He got to know.
Great. Yeah. It's interesting, and I mean, Jonathan, you will have made similar experiences, I suppose, with the whole deadline and time aspect of such a book project, because I think the research publications are notorious for taking a long time and for having these various rounds. And we should probably talk a little bit about the peer review process as well. But it feels like it's a very long project, but then you have these deadlines coming, very, very quickly, and then suddenly there's the next deadline. So what did that feel like? Did it all fly by, or did it feel like a very long project? What was the experience on your end?
It depends on where we were in the timeline, right?
Yeah.
When all the 40 chapters had come in, it felt like it really flew by.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were phases which were very tight, obviously, and a lot had to be done in very little time. And there were other phases where we could concentrate on other work as well. But I actually checked it. We sent out the invitations in spring 2019. Early spring 2019, and we submitted the full volume in May 2021. So it was really a 2-year project, which was very good for that kind of volume with 40 chapters. And throughout this period, I would say we were busy with it. You have to send out the invitations. You have to see what you get. You have to find people for the chapters where you don't get a confirmation or for additional chapters that come up. You have to discuss co-authorships, etc., etc. Then you have to see the abstracts that come in and comment on them. Then you wait for the actual first drafts, but the first drafts are really only drafts and manuscripts. I mean, they are quite some way from where you end up in the process. And then you have to go through all these various steps. So 2 years is not really a lot of time for that kind of process, and then you have to coordinate with the publishing house, etc.
And I mean, and we also, when you're an editor, you follow the project very closely, because we have an idea, of course, even though the authors are, of course, allowed to write their own chapter. But as editors, we have an idea of how we would like the book to be. So obviously, sometimes we propose quite strictly, this is what we'd like you to write.
Fair enough. It's your book.
Yeah, exactly. And if you want all the chapters to be seen as a whole, for example, we don't want different authors to talk about the same thing in 2 different chapters. So that might be one thing where we say that, no, this is not, you cannot talk about this because the other author will take it up, and so on. That also depends on our own working process, but we were quite decided from the beginning that we wanted this to be a peer-reviewed handbook, not just reviewed by Michaela and I, but that every chapter should also be peer-reviewed by another person. And most of the authors in the book were generous enough to peer review for us. And then we had somewhere where we wanted special expertise to double check. So we also had external peer reviewers for a few chapters. And obviously, it's not like when you peer review for a journal where the journal editor will then tell you, sorry, this cannot go into our journal. But we wanted a peer review where people would say that, you have not covered this very important area, or the way you describe this research process is not clear enough, and things like that, which we also got a lot. And also whether someone overlooked really important sources and stuff like that. And then, so we had that peer review first, and then the authors made a second draft. And for the second draft, Michaela and I read all the chapters. We were responsible for one of us were the main responsible person for one chapter, but then the other person read it as well. So it was really a very thorough and quite long process for before we had the final version. And then, of course, when you get when the authors have responded to the review, we also have to double check that they actually understood us correctly, so that we don't get something back where, we meant this, oh no, but it became something completely different.
Yeah.
And we were not lenient. We were quite tough, actually. I mean, in two cases,
yes.
We were at the verge of actually declining to accept the chapter. And we had to work really hard with the people to get it to a stage where we could say, okay, now we can accept it. So, yeah.
But then we also have to compliment these contributors, because they decided, despite that we were quite hard on them, they also decided to continue to work on it. Because, you could also, as an author, say that, oh no, but this is too much work, I won't do it. But they actually, they hung in there and struggled really hard, but also produced a very nice chapter in the end. So,
yes, and hopefully, this will show, and authors, editors, and readers will all be happy with the outcome.
Absolutely, yeah. And the listeners, of course, can't see it, but Jonathan and I have been sort of nodding heavily, because we have really pointed it out explicitly, but we have submitted a chapter as well. And we were oftentimes on the receiving end of the feedback and the criticism. But I wanted to just state for the record that it was always very fair, and it was always very clear that it was for there was a purpose. You wanted to have the best chapter possible from the contributors to have the best handbook in the end. So I think that's absolutely fair game, and it was at least for me, I can say it was a very enjoyable cooperation. Although, of course, sometimes the deadlines were tough, and there was a lot of sort of detail work involved. And for someone who isn't really used to academic publishing, it may have been quite difficult, which was certainly the case for the two Alexes here. But Jonathan, maybe real briefly, how would you compare it to the two books that you have published, also with Routledge, incidentally? But what was sort of similar? What was completely different? Because you were the one, behind the project, and you didn't have a co-editor, you didn't have, maybe you had reviewers, but what was the process like, just in comparison?
It's a very different process when you're writing. I don't like calling them monographs, because I would prefer they get called pop science books.
Monograph sounds very serious.
When you're writing a book yourself, it will get reviewed in various ways, but you're the person on the hook for fixing everything. The biggest difference that I found was this: the first time that I'd co-authored in such a large group. So I've co-authored, I think, a couple of times, but with one person at a time. And there it's just you bounce off each other. There was a project recently I co-authored with Graham Turner, which should be coming out very soon, I hope. Paper coming out, and there it was just bouncing off each other and making sure that we got everything that we wanted to say done, and you split up the work. With this, it was 4 authors working together, coming at it from very different angles with very different levels of expertise. And so that made it a really interesting process. In terms of reviewing, it reminded me a lot of if you write an article for one of the leading journals. So if you write an article for interpreting or for translation and interpreting studies, or a journal like that, you expect that the reviewers will come back and will find things that need changed. I remember my supervisor once saying that if a reviewer can't find anything to change, they're not a very good reviewer. And so you expect that, I realized one of the things that I hadn't paid enough notice to at the start is when you're co-authoring with 3 other people, keeping style consistent and keeping approach consistent is actually very hard, because no one wants to squash someone else's style. But by the same token, you don't want it to look like 4 people have written it. and that was something that I realized that I made a mistake early on, that I forgot that's how important that is, because the last big project I had done with 4 authors on it was a massive report, so you expected different sections to look different because it was like a 40,000 word report, and so that was normal. 4 people working on something so small, it was
so small.
It was an education.
Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes it gets really technical as well. Just style editing technical, and it's so annoying, but still required. So, like for instance, the type of style for the reference list that is in the handbook. Now I get very technical. I'm sorry. Is not, you cannot use a program to produce that, and that was not something we chose. It just ended up like that. So we had a few authors coming back to us asking, but I put it in my reference system. Why can't I sort of take it out and it will produce this reference list? So instead, you have to choose the one which is almost closest, and then you have to do it manually, and that takes ages, of course. And I understand that it's annoying. And I remember Jonathan and I having a discussion about the links in the text, because some of these reference programs produce links in the text, and when we submit it to the editors, there can't be any links in the text. And Jonathan didn't even realize, because in his programs it didn't look like links in the text. So I wrote angry messages like, "You have to take the links away." And Jonathan was like, "What links? Where are they?"
I remember that. Yeah. Yeah, so just to explain real briefly, so a reference manager is basically a piece of software that you can use to manage all the books, monographs, and other publications that you refer to in your piece of writing, and just to make it easy to keep track of it. And usually you can ideally you can just push a button and you get a nicely formatted list at the end. But as Elisabet just said, sometimes that doesn't correspond to the house style or whatever specifications that you get, and then you end up having to manually go in and fix a few things.
One day I will learn, because my reference manager allows you to write a custom reference style, and one day I will spend the however long it takes to learn how to do that, because there's a famous thing in interpreting studies that most of our journals, like the year of the reference, then a colon, then the page number. That's not any standard Zotero style. Zotero is my reference manager. So one day I'm going to learn how to fix that in Zotero, so that I can just press interpreting journals beware and it will fix it all for me.
Yeah, you can probably have a template or something like that. Exactly.
Yeah, because it all works on templates.
But speaking about this, we really have to mention Livia Bartes, Michaela, because without her we would have struggled much more.
Yeah. It was a lot of work, and she made it doable by, in the end, taking care of putting the formatting of the 40 chapters together, and really making them transferable to Routledge. That was excellent. Yeah, that was a big help.
So Livia is also a conference interpreter who has worked a little bit in different projects for Michaela, and she took up on her to sort of do the final streamline. And also, that when you've read a text very many times, you get blind for the text. So having somebody coming in and doing that was so good and so very well done.
So, and just so that we get a complete picture, so we've talked a little bit about peer review and the different rounds of notes and feedback, and just explain to us briefly what sort of the final steps are. So at some point you have the final versions of the individual articles, and you write your own introduction. What are the sort of missing steps that some people may not be aware of, to having a final publication, a final book?
Well, what else? I mean, you have to hand in the bio notes of all the contributors and authors, and make sure that those are in a certain form and a certain length, and also to some extent, in the same in style and format. And then you have to. Did we write up the blurb? I think we gave some input.
Ideas for the blurb, yeah.
Ideas for the blurb, and they wrote up the blurb, and the
blurb is a short marketing text, if I'm not mistaken, for the book.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah, okay. A short marketing text, and then you have to get the abstracts and the keywords right, because the keywords will then feed into the index. And we did an excellent job. We were very clever and outsourced this to Routledge. Because, I mean, at the end of the project, we really felt we have done quite a bit of work, and enough is enough. And had we then had to really sit down and do the index, I mean, that would have killed us. So from the very beginning, we made sure to tell Routledge, okay, the index is in your hands, and that was a very good thing to do. We had to make sure that all the copyright issues were in order, especially with graphs and stuff.
Jonathan's favorite topic.
Yeah. All this has to be taken care of.
Sure. Yeah.
And the cross-references, all the chapters are cross-referenced. So if you talk about a special topic in one chapter, then you reference to the chapter dealing with that topic.
Then they needed people who would write a little, advocate it or advertise it. Experts in the field, like we had Donovan from the ESIT, and then we had Ricardo Munoz, a translation professor, who wrote up a little passage to say what he felt was in the book and why he would recommend the book to the community. So those kinds of things. So I mean, it's kind of never ends. It's
and you want to pick the people who write that type of promotion. You want to pick them really well. So choosing someone from the ESIT, which is one of the big interpreting programs, is of course important. And the same thing with Ricardo Munoz. So Claire Donovan was the person from ESIT, and then Ricardo Munoz Martin, who is in cognitive translation studies, and although he's a translation professor, the fact that he is in cognition and has covered a lot of that is important because of conference interpreting being a lot of cognition. not only but
But the tricky thing was, since most of the experts were in our volume, I mean,
you can't ask
people to write a promotion text on your own book.
Yeah.
So it was really hard to find somebody.
Sure.
Yeah, and I was going to say, first good choice on outsourcing the index, having done 2 indices. Yes, that's a very good choice.
Yeah, absolutely. That would have been just too much.
And no matter how you do it, no matter which software you use, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to get flashbacks. I'm going to have to go get counselling.
Yeah, I know.
But also the fact that you managed to find people who weren't in the book to write the blurb for it, and the fact that you found people with such excellent reputation says something about the book itself. Do you have a release date for it?
Well, now we're in the final copy editing phase, which is also sort of an overwhelming stage, which you don't really expect when you send off the book and think that, no, this is it. And then the copy editor comes back with questions like, do you want double quotes or single quotes here? Or
yeah. All the tiny details.
Yeah.
And also to get people to do the proof revisions within a very short time frame, because for that you don't have that much time, so you virtually send them the chapters telling them we need that back within 7 days or 10 days or so. So all of this is it's a never-ending story.
But this is now wrapping up, so we're
it is.
So we hope that it will be published by December, right, Michaela?
Yeah. Actually, November. They are aiming for November,
right.
and that will be we'd love that to happen.
Mm.
And there is on the Routledge page, you see this little announcement where you can find some information, and we'll be ever so happy to send you the link.
Yeah, we'll make sure all the links are in the show notes, of course, so people can check it out.
And if someone's wondering about the cover, there were only a limited amount of covers to choose from.
And none of them had anything to do with interpreting.
No.
So
the great covers debate.
Yeah.
We could have a long chat about covers and how far authors can bend the rules on covers, and when the publisher just says nope.
Yeah.
There's not much flexibility, that's true. And
but again, as with all things regarding the volume, we immediately agreed which one to choose from the small selection we had.
Yeah, this has
between the two of you, you mean?
Yeah, this has been amazing in the process that we sort of, trip around a little bit and say, so what do you think about this? And then one of us sort of, I was sort of aiming for, and then the other one chips in, the blue one. And exactly, the blue one.
Well, that's wonderful. Yeah, that's wonderful. I was going to ask you a mean question, and you don't have to answer, but I'd love you to answer. Is it more or less what you expected? Are you? I mean, I'm pretty sure you're happy, if not if just for the fact that it's over now, almost over. But is it sort of coming together in the way that you had imagined, more or less?
Better.
Yeah.
I was hoping you'd say that.
No, definitely better.
Yeah, I think so. I will agree, definitely. It was, although I knew it would be a lot of work when I started, it was really even more work than I could envisage. But I also think I agree. I definitely agree with Michaela. I also think it turned out even better than I thought when we started. Yeah.
We have really strong chapters. We have, we have the people we wanted on board are on board with very, very few exceptions. I mean, maybe one or two exceptions who just couldn't make it. And we feel that we really cover the full range of topics. And then we have our pet subjects, like a chapter on India and a chapter on mindfulness and a chapter on community and conference interpreting. And we have the practitioners in, you guys. And we have the sign conference interpreting in, which normally is dealt with in the community interpreting section or field. So I think we are very happy with the way it came out, aren't we, Elisabet?
Yeah, definitely.
In many, many ways.
Yes,
really
yes.
Ways.
And we're happy to say that in the sign language conference interpreting chapter, we also have a deaf conference interpreter present as an author. And the neuro-linguistics chapter that we got, Elisabet Adelman, which is a very, very pleasant researcher and also really digging into new depths of conference interpreting, and also the mindfulness in conference interpreting, which for me was the absolutely farthest away from where I am, but which was super interesting read.
Okay.
Really.
Yeah, I wanted that one in.
Yeah.
And then also, you had to have those names you grew up with: Sylvia Kalina, Barbara Moser-Mercer, Daniel Gilles. I mean, this is just so nice to be in touch with these people and to have them say, yes, I'm on. I will contribute a chapter. That was just a fantastic experience.
And who also teamed up with a younger researcher to write the chapter, and who was, willing to, and I think that says a lot as well, willing to open up to new ideas and new thoughts, and going on to like Daniel Gilles, who went on to see because he's always been pushing this idea of theory in training, and now pursuing whether is there any theory in training? What is it? What we have been preaching as researchers all these years. So is it really there? And Sylvia doing an overview of what in conference interpreting pedagogy really is. And how it has developed, and where do we stand now, and so on. Yeah. So lots of fascinating
And she was a leading figure in actually developing interpreting didactics, wasn't she?
Yeah, definitely.
So, she's really the person to have on that kind of chapter. And I mean, she was my conference interpreting teacher, by the way, in Heidelberg.
I was going to say something similar. I got to meet her at a NAIC meeting and I was just sitting next to her at a dinner. And we were just among colleagues and she was just so approachable, but I really felt in awe. So I think I can kind of relate to what you were just saying.
You do get starstruck with certain figures.
Yeah.
I've been in certain rooms and gone, I don't know how I got here, but I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
But also, I mean, it seems to be a really key time in the history of conference interpreting. You know, if we zoom out a little bit, you have the 100 Years of Interpreting conference that came recently, and the volume coming out from that. We have the Routledge Handbook of Conference Interpreting now coming out, and now we have an EST Congress next year.
So that's another good evidence, I guess, of maybe a stronger focus on research, because we had IEC, I think, funding research more as well, and CUT conferences also. So definitely very good to see.
Yeah.
I don't know, Jonathan, did you have any more questions on the book, or it feels like we've covered pretty much the entire process?
But I would say, if anyone's thinking of writing a book about interpreting, it's a process, but it's a process worth doing. Someone said to me when I was doing my PhD that unless your ideas are ever tested, you don't know if they're any good. And I wish I remember who told me that. But the publishing process is a very good way of testing your ideas, especially when you have reviewers around. And good reviewers are there for your good and for the good of what is being written. And yes, good reviewers make you work hard. That's their job.
Yeah, and it's very fulfilling. I mean, and it's also a learning experience in many ways.
Definitely. Let me share with you how I deal with reviews. They are often a little bit upsetting when you get them, because you submit you tear out a piece of your heart and you submit it to a journal or a volume, and you get it back, and some people have different ideas than you do. So you get a long list of
too.
Exactly. So you get a long list of what you shouldn't do. So what I do is that I write it down in a table, and I start with my, sometimes offended answers, and then I go through them again. And then I realize after a while that, well, these suggestions, they're actually quite good. So when you've gone through your table 2 or 3 times, you realize that what the reviewer said actually has a very good point usually, and is making your paper better.
I remember there was a paper that I recently had come out, and the reviews were generally kind, and then there was just one line in it that said, "You should include a paragraph about this," and I emailed the editor and said, "Well, it's funny, I was trying to avoid talking about that." So it's the kind of things that reviewers make you do. One thing that is good to finish on whenever we have researchers on the show, and we've touched on it a little bit with Please Everyone Go to EST Congress, but if you were talking to master's students or people who've been interpreting for a while and they think, I really want to get into research, or even practitioners who say, how would I find good, useful research? How do I get into it? What would you recommend to them?
Well, the best way of doing it is be part of a research project as an assistant, or as a doctoral student, later as a postdoc. That's probably the way forward, because then you are really integrated into the whole process and you learn each step: publication, data collection, data analysis, etc., etc.
I'd say exactly that. You must be in a community, and often one tend to think that it's going to be so difficult for me to start research, and it takes so much time, and there's no use doing it. But in fact, as interpreters, I think we're very lucky, because we have a job where we don't work every day as interpreters. Usually, I mean, it depends, but so it means that we have a certain amount of hours that we can dispose of as we like. and using those hours to go into a type of research community and start discussing and start throwing ideas, and also being. I think I wrote to you the other day, Jonathan, that perseverance is a very beautiful word.
You need that. You need that.
Yeah. So you have to be patient and also show perseverance, because it is very likely that when you start throwing out your ideas, because this is what happens when you work in the booth, somebody has already done something about it. So instead of getting the answer which you would think you'd get, oh, that's really interesting, let's do a research project, the answer you get is, oh yeah, somebody wrote about this, here, go read this article. So, and then you have to be open and say that, oh, interesting, somebody wrote about it, I'll read the article and I'll come back with a new idea. And eventually, and usually, that's how you end up, creating a project that you can actually pursue. And because of our work, we have the possibility of pursuing a PhD while still working. So we don't have to go away and live on a very, very small teaching grant or something like that. We can actually pursue the research while we're working. And also, not all research may have to be very big, or a PhD or a grand project. Mm-hmm. You can work as a research assistant in a bigger project and do a small thing, or you can do a little piece of research that you can share with other groups of people. And the AIC fund is a great opportunity to do that as well. Although as having some insight in the review committee, I know we look a lot on mm-hmm. into viability of a project. So obviously, if you don't have that research network, the reviewer will say, well, how is this viable? But if you have a research network and do a small study and come up with an idea for this, then it's perfectly viable.
And you should also maybe relate to the people that the satisfaction level is very high. You know, you get a lot of satisfaction out of. I mean, if you can't push it through, if you can't, finish it off, then it might be a different thing. But if you have that kind of perseverance and maybe the network or whatever it takes, it's really highly satisfactory.
Yeah.
And very much recommendable. I mean, a PhD project, you don't come out the same person as you go in. No way. Yeah. And as Elisabet said, not everybody has to do a PhD. So you get satisfaction and a lot of learning experience, even from a small project. But that, I feel, is always worth mentioning.
Yeah. And also what we don't realize, we talk about the gap, but in fact, so many of your colleagues are actually researchers. So many of those you meet in the booth, like me, or like Jonathan, or like Karin Reithofer, or who helped me with other names, or Fele Duflo.
Those were good examples. There are many more. Yeah.
Or Fele Duflo, or Ebru is still working, Ebru Diriker. So when you meet your research colleagues, go talk to them. We are nerds. We love talking about our research. So.
And interpreters love to talk about their job. So it's also maybe just one more idea is to also participate in research activities as a subject. So I've seen, for example, that I think Kilian's project is traveling to Brussels looking for subjects. So that's also a good, maybe more low barrier way as well of engaging with research.
I'm really honoured whenever I get an email from a master's student or a PhD student saying, can I interview you or can you fill in this survey? Mm-hmm. I like interviews because I know myself. I did interviews during my PhD and I used to joke, I shared an office with someone who's doing a PhD on literary translation, and I used to joke that in interpreting, if gathering your data isn't making you physically sweat, you're probably not doing it right. Data gathering is so, in some ways, it's the most difficult part because you're relying on goodwill, you're relying on a chance. Often you're relying on people saying yes. And so I'm always honoured when I get an email from someone saying, I'm doing a research project in such and such, can I interview you? because I know how precious that data is, especially if you're doing a master's degree and you've maybe got, 3-6 months. I know how valuable that can be for people.
No, yeah, but if you find that you have time, I agree with Jonathan. It's you should always try to answer those surveys, or it may seem annoying, but there is a budding interpreting researcher out there who will maybe be the next, who do we know? Daniel Gilles.
Franz
So
Böchacker.
try to support them. Franz Böchacker, yeah.
But yeah, Michaela, Elisabet, thank you so much for joining us tonight for this debrief of the Routledge Handbook of Conference Interpreting. We're really looking forward to seeing the final book, and I assume so are you. One of you just said that sometimes at the other end of a project you have changed as a person, and that's probably the case for these big publications as well. But as you said earlier, you're really happy with the result, and it came out even better than you expected, which is, I think, a good thing to say and something to be very proud of. I can say for myself again that it was a pleasure working with you and contributing the chapter, and I hope that Jonathan and the others who are not here tonight would agree. And it's been great to get a little bit of a behind the scenes view at what it's like to publish a book. So thank you both very much, and to all the listeners, we of course encourage you to check out the book. We'll provide the information in the show notes for you to have a look, and then you can buy it yourself or find it at your local library, hopefully. And maybe just as a very final thing, just real quick answers. What's the chapter that people should read first? I'm not asking you to pick your favorite ones, but maybe you can pick one that people can read first, or maybe not. If you're not comfortable with that, that's fine.
No, it depends on your interests. We can't say, it very much depends on your interests. Whether you want some background in the fundamentals, in the modes, or whether you want to know about the country-specific chapters, or whether you want to know some cognitive processing related stuff, or really then the more innovative things like mindfulness training. It very much depends on the reader. I don't think we can say it in a general way.
But let's say if you're a practitioner, you should start with the troublesome terps chapter, and then go on to the mindfulness chapter. And from that, you may want to explore the different areas of conference interpreting, or the different areas of the world where conference interpreting is present. And you would, of course, benefit from the history of interpreting. And then you
always
might
a big topic.
And many struggle with English as a lingua franca, so that would be Michaelas chapter, how to deal with that and the difficulties of that. And when you've come that far, you can also read my chapter about the differences and commonalities of conference and community interpreting. And if you survive that far, then you're good to go into the theories and research of interpreting.
Yeah, and I think the technology chapters, remote distance interpreting, and the technologies surrounding interpreting, that would be very interesting for most people, because there's no way around it anymore.
And now we have at EST Congress next year quite a few panels that really speak quite strongly to, how much do we know about interpreting? How do we know this? I don't know if I saw a specific conference interpreting panel, but we're beginning to really dig into the foundations again. Was this deliberate timing on your part that you saw a lot of these things coming, or was it just, no, this is the right time to do it?
It was virtually just being approached and then realizing that there is no such volume, single one volume covering conference interpreting, plus our fascination with the topic. So we felt we would really love to do this. This is how it happened. But it was not a prior master plan saying, oh, it's now time to finally, go for it. It wasn't like that.
No. And it might be a little late now because the call has already closed. But if they decide to extend it, the call for the EST Congress actually has a panel with Michaela and I talking about the the two strands of, if you choose that it's only two strands, but at least in our case now, what we'd like to explore are the two strands of interpreting as dialogue interpreting and conference interpreting, and what we can find in common, and also maybe differences, but commonalities in terms of cognitive aspects in the two fields. So we're hoping that we can have a conference panel on that too, and pursue that area as well.
And when is the EST conference taking place?
June
EST.
2020.
Yeah, it's the EST.
In Oslo.
It's the European Society for Translation Studies.
Translation studies.
Yeah, it's in Oslo, and it's from the 22nd to the 24th of June.
Yes.
In 2022. And although Oslo, Norway, is extremely expensive,
it is. I have family over there.
Yeah, it might really be worth exploring the possibilities of going there. Usually, EST congresses are very big, but they also cover everything. So, if you're interested in getting a glimpse of what this is about, it's really a good way of getting it there.
Elisabet is on the EST board, and she's.
Yeah, that's why I'm promoting it so much.
Fair enough.
Have they put you on commission this time? But I think as well, the EST Congress is definitely the biggest research congress that I've ever been to, and also it's the friendliest. It's one of the few that I would quite happily fork out my own money to go to, because we used to have a saying in Heriot, if you want to know what researchers were thinking 2 years ago, you read the journals. If you want to know what they were thinking 3 months ago, you go to a conference. If you want to know what they're thinking now, you have coffee with them.
Exactly.
And so EST Congress is basically
a good one, yeah.
Short of sharing a department with someone, it's the nearest you're going to get to finding out exactly what's on the cutting edge. And there have been occasions where the cutting edge has changed because of EST Congress, because of people being in the room together and going, oh, but this, but that, but this. It's just a wonderful place to be, and it's probably, I can't imagine how much research EST Congress must have driven just getting all of these people in the same room.
Yeah, and that is, the EST is also, if any PhD students are listening, the EST is also funding PhD students with travel grants for the Congress. So that's a good way of making it a little bit more accessible. And then the Young Scholar Prize is also handed out during the ESC Congress, and the Young Scholar Prize is the prize for the best. Help me now, Jonathan. Jonathan used to be on the board, but the best PhD for the past...
best PhD dissertation that has come out in the previous 3 years, I believe. And tiny bit of trivia, as far as I'm aware, no interpreting scholar has ever won the Young Scholar. So it'd be good to see...
No, Minwa.
Nikki,
Minwa.
Did Meanwhile you win it?
Oh, won it, yes.
Okay, I didn't. Oh, so there has been an interpreter winning.
So Minwa has won it, but interpreted. I mean, obviously, if we look at interpreting versus translation, we're a much smaller crowd. But interpreting scholars, send in your PhDs.